Well, good evening. Just checking to see that the video is going to start. Just make sure that everything's up and running as it should be. Maybe it takes a few seconds to catch up. So this will be the last part of looking at Judge Hamilton's. Well, we've looked at obviously Judge Fox's opinion at the appeal stage, and then obviously Judge Hamilton's decision, of which this is the final part of his, was really what sealed the fate of Brendan. And of course we came across that famous line from Making a Murder #2, didn't we? We came across this quote from Hamilton, which was highlighted by Kathleen Zellner, even assuming, however, that the majority's interpretation is plausible. Our job as a federal court reviewing a state conviction is not to consult scholarly literature in search of new best practices. And quite rightly, Kathleen Zellner points out, well, why not? Particularly when those particular scholars, in particular, are Dr. Richard Leo, that we've had the pleasure of speaking to, the likes of Saul Kassan, and obviously you'd have to include in the group of experts our very own Steve Drizzen and Laura Nyrider. Anyway, so this is the final part, so let's just call up the final part of the this was the dissenting opinion, but this was crucial because it meant that Judge Fox had an ally in Judge Hamilton. So let's have a read through what he's written in this final part. It shouldn't take too long to get through. So even if we were to approach the question de novo, there is good reason to review any alleged promises by investigators from an objective point of view, at least when we have hard evidence of what was said and what was not. People who commit brutal crimes of the sort Dassey was convicted of, committed, tend to be maladjusted and detached from social norms. Judge Hamilton, I would suggest that adequately describes you. You are completely maladjusted and detached from social norms if you are writing this kind of garbage. It should come as no surprise that a juvenile who helps to rape a helpless victim caps off that experience by watching television and chatting with his uncle. How detached do you need to be, Hamilton? And then helps to murder their victim, as Dassey said he did, lives with a distorted worldview. Yes, you certainly do, Hamilton. Isn't it ironic how these people are often describing themselves and their own fantasies, like Ken Kratz in his press conference? Dassey's subjective impression of what police told him should not be decisive. Secondly, the majority suggests that Dassey was at greater risk of being led by the investigators' vague moral support because they repeatedly told him that they already knew what happened. And this is crucial, isn't it? The fact that they are able to lie to him about everything. And you know, Brendan would have said whatever they wanted. As the majority construes these statements, Dassey could have believed that so long as he was honest, nothing bad would happen to him. The majority cites no case from the Supreme Court or any other court holding that such bluffing by police about what they know could render a confession involuntary. As I say, Hamilton, you know, America is the only English-speaking country in the world that allows, as you call it, bluffing, which sounds a very soft, friendly term. I would call it outright lying, deceiving, and misleading. On the contrary, we have recognized that a lie that relates to the suspect's connection to the crime is the least likely to render a confession involuntary. And in this case, States versus Sturdivant, interesting, surname Sturdivant, quite well known to us. We have repeatedly held that a law enforcement agent may actively mislead a defendant in order to obtain a confession, so long as the rational decision remains possible. Alteration in original, quoting Connor versus McBride. Third, in concluding that Dassey's confession was involuntary, the majority effectively departs from a string of our habeas decisions involving confessions by juveniles who were denied relief despite being subject to far greater pressures than Dassey was. In other words, because we've got it wrong in the past, we can continue to get it wrong because we don't really want to think about the fact that we've got it wrong. For instance, in Etherley, we reversed habeas relief for a petitioner with no prior criminal justice experience who at the age 15 was taken from his home before dawn and interviewed by police several hours later without the consent, let alone the presence of a parent or other friendly adult. Like Dassey, Etherley had borderline intellectual abilities. Like the investigators here, the police in Etherley assured the juvenile that it would go better for him in court if he cooperated. In Carter versus Thompson, we denied relief to a habeas petitioner who at age 16 endured an interrogation lasting 55 hours in total. During gaps in the interrogation, the petitioner slept on a bench without a pillow, a blanket, or change of clothes. See also Murdoch versus Dorothy, denying relief to a 16-year-old who was interrogated over a 7-hour period, and Gilbert denying relief to a 15-year-old who was kept from his mother and interrogated over a 9-hour period. And you know, Hamilton, you should be proud of the fact that these were victims that weren't given relief, habeas relief, and so therefore, because they weren't given it, we're not going to give it to Brendan. Okay. And if you're on the lineup here, Hardaway versus Young, denying relief to 14-year-old who was interviewed over a 16-hour period and abandoned for lengthy intervals in interrogation room. The majority describes these cases but makes no real effort to reconcile them with the relief it grants Dassey. Instead, it criticizes the Wisconsin Court of Appeals for failing to elaborate on all the factors the majority considers important. As explained above, 2254 does not authorize federal courts to critique state courts' opinions so closely. It is enough that the state court identified the correct legal standard and applied it reasonably to the facts of the case, just as police investigators will be left scratching their heads after this decision. State and federal courts will be flummoxed their attempt to reconcile our grant of habeas relief to Dassey with the line of cases pointing the other way. Again, just more confirmation. Because we've been getting it wrong so many times, we're holding on to this ever-rising balloon. We've got more and more wrongful convictions, proved wrongful by DNA, that involve false confessions, coerced confessions, but we're not going to change anything. 4. The details of Dassey's confession. Having replaced deference to the state court with what amounts to de novo review, and having redefined what counts as a false promise of leniency, the majority evaluates Dassey's confession in the light most favorable to him. The majority opinion highlights the moments when Dassey seemed most hesitant or ambivalent. I have no quarrel with the majority's consideration of those moments. We need to consider Dassey's strongest arguments as well as the strongest arguments advanced by the state. At a few points, the investigators' questions were so assertive and leading that it is difficult to tell whether Dassey made an honest attempt at a truthful answer or simply offered up the answer he believed the investigators were fishing for. This is the point, isn't it? If you're not sure about some of it, a bit like Fassbender, not sure what, on TV, Dr. Phil, I think it was, do you think he really did all that he did? And Tom Fassbender, well, I don't know. I don't know that he did everything. So if you don't know he did some of it, you don't know he did anything of it, any of it. Anyway, a good example. The investigators believed that Teresa Halbach had been shot in the head by a bullet that went through wood, a detail that had not been reported in the media. A burnt fragment of her skull recovered from the fire pit had traces of lead in it, or on it. If Dassey knew that Teresa had been shot in the head, that knowledge would tend to corroborate his story. The investigators asked Dassey, "What else did you do? Come on, something with the head." Dassey floundered, volunteering that his uncle Avery cut off some of Teresa's hair and punched her in the head, and that he, Dassey, slit Teresa's throat. Apparently exasperated. What do you mean, apparently? You know, it's not apparent. It was obvious. You know, it did. Anyway. All right, I'm just going to come out and ask you, who shot her in the head? Avery did, Dassey replied, adding that he did not volunteer the information because he couldn't think of it. It's reasonable to be skeptical about Dassey's response to such a leading question, at least taking the response in isolation. Oh dear. But for every point when Dassey seemed uncertain or confused, at many other points, Dassey gave specific and incriminating answers to open-ended questions. Most important, Dassey volunteered specific and incriminating details about what he did, what he saw, what he heard, and even what he smelled. How do you prove what he saw, what he heard, and what he smelled, and what he did? Gee whiz. Early in the interview, the investigators asked Dassey what Avery told him and showed him after he arrived at Avery's trailer. Dassey said, "He showed me the knife and the rope." And they then asked Dassey where he saw Teresa. Dassey said she was lying dead in the back of her Jeep and that Avery told him he stabbed her. They asked why Avery had invited Dassey over. Dassey said, probably to get rid of the body. When the investigators asked what happened next, Dassey admitted that he helped his uncle move Teresa's body to the burn pit. When they asked Dassey to describe Teresa's injuries, he said she had been stabbed in her stomach, a detail he repeated several times and is completely uncorroborated. There is no evidence whatsoever that she was repeatedly stabbed. The condition of Teresa's remains made it impossible to confirm or refute that fact. The investigators suspected Dassey had left out some important information. They asked how Dassey knew Teresa was already dead when he saw her in the Jeep. Dassey volunteered that he heard some screaming while riding his bike outside. He then admitted that he entered Avery's trailer and saw Teresa. He said that Teresa was handcuffed to Avery's bed. When the investigators asked Dassey what Avery told him, Dassey said that he never got some of that stuff, so he wanted to get some, adding that Avery wanted to her so hard. While it took more than a little coaxing from the investigators before Dassey admitted that he too raped Teresa, Dassey soon provided quite specific details about his role in the crime. He said that Teresa begged him to do the right thing, that Avery conversely praised him for doing a good job, that he helped Avery tie up Teresa, and that he slit her throat and cut her hair. Dassey described the brutal cremation, recalling how he and Avery carried Teresa's body to the burn pit and covered her with branches and tires. Yeah, but you would have to have cut the body up. There is no mention of cutting the body up. When the investigators asked Dassey how he and Avery cleaned the crime scene, he recounted their efforts. We threw gas on a pool of blood so he could get it off. Then he tried paint thinner, and then we went to bleach to get it off, and he went like he was spraying it. I thought he got it on the floor, and it splashed up on my pants. The investigators retrieved Dassey's pants from his home. Sure enough, they were stained with bleach, but no blood. In addition, on his jeans or anywhere. In addition to answering open-ended questions in specific and incriminating detail, Dassey resisted several lines of inquiry. Those points of resistance gave the state courts, substantial reason to find that Dassey's will was not overborne. Recall that the investigators were keenly interested in any information Dassey could offer about how and when Teresa Halbach was shot. They asked him how many times he shot Teresa. 0, he replied. He added that he didn't even touch the gun, explaining that he had been unable to shoot ever since his mother's ex-boyfriend had shot their sick cat. After Dassey admitted that he cut Teresa's hair at Avery's urging, the investigators asked him what had become of the hair. Dassey insisted that he did not know and did not have the hair, even when the investigators warned Dassey that they would find the hair if he had kept it. He insisted, "I don't got none of the hair." At another point in the interview, the investigators asked Dassey whether he saw Avery rape Teresa. 3 times Dassey said no. They repeatedly asked Dassey whether he and Avery had used wires hanging in the garage to harm Teresa. Dassey insisted they had not. He rejected their suggestion that he and Avery might have hung Teresa from a rafter, even after the investigators pointed out that the worst was over and nothing he said would surprise them. In one of the most direct tests of Dassey's suggestibility, I suspect we might be getting onto the control question, the investigators told him falsely that Teresa had a tattoo on her stomach and asked him if he remembered it. Dassey said no. They pressed Dassey, asking if he disagreed with them. Dassey replied, "No, but I don't know what it was." He doesn't say, "I don't know where it was." He says he doesn't know what it was. And the reason he says it doesn't know what it was, because he had just agreed that there was a tattoo when there wasn't. And he knew perfectly well that the next thing they were going to ask was, describe the tattoo. But I don't know what it was. If Dassey was so overwhelmed by the police questioning, as the majority seems to believe, surely he would have simply agreed that Teresa had a tattoo on her stomach. That, Hamilton, is exactly what he did do. You need to speak to the dude. And that he kept her hair, and that he hung her from the rafters, and so on. To be sure, this is wonderful understatement, that Hamilton. To be sure, Dassey's confession was not a smooth and consistent story. You are not kidding there. That is one of the biggest understatements of the century, Hamilton. There were holes in the narrative. Holes. Holes. Dassey waffled and backtracked. Yes, the sequence of events was not always clear. And not always, it was never clear. The majority reviewing the interview, with its defense-friendly key in hand, takes these inconsistencies as proof that Dassey was not recounting real memories, but only telling the investigators what he believed they wanted to hear. As an alternative key for reviewing Dassey's confession, one might consider that the 16-year-old subject was racked with guilt and was finally coming to grips with the gravity of his crimes. Do you really think so? He was so racked with guilt and the gravity of his crimes that he wanted to go back to school and wondered if he was only arrested for one day? He's coming to grips with the gravity of his crime and racked by guilt? I don't think so. He had been led to do things so awful. Yeah, he had been led by police investigators to do things so awful that in the months following the crimes, he stayed silent but lost 40 pounds and had fits of uncontrolled sobbing. Owning up to what he did proved difficult for Dassey, as it surely would for anyone with a trace of conscience. He had trouble getting the words out. Given the vagaries of human memory, it is not surprising that some details and sequences had become garbled as he replayed those violent and grisly images over and over in his mind for 4 months. It is easy to understand why, by the time of the March 1st interview, Dassey was not sure about everything that had happened and in what order. While Dassey's recollection of the sequence of events was hazy, he remembered some details vividly. He remembered colours, sounds, and smells. Well, and I say, how do you prove that? You've already said you can't corroborate that. He remembered his uncle standing in the doorframe in his white shirt and red shorts, beckoning him inside. He remembered Teresa Halbach lying alive on his uncle's bed and later dead in the back of her Jeep. He remembered her screams. Again, none of this can be corroborated, can be proven, because it never happened. He remembered telling him he remembered her telling him he did not have to rape her and he should do the right thing. He remembered her blood pooling on the garage floor. He remembered the odor of her burning flesh. And he remembered why he committed the cruel acts he described. He wanted to see how it felt. The majority writes that the lack of physical evidence was the weakest part of the state's case. The physical evidence does not prove or disprove Dassey's guilt or the accuracy of his confession. Still, the state offered substantial evidence that tended to corroborate some details of his confession. Examples include handcuffs and leg irons found in Avery's bedroom, which would not hold a goldfish, corroborating Dassey's description of Teresa's rape. A charred shovel, rake and seat car, corroborating Dassey's description of the crude cremation of Teresa's body, and a stipulation by a family friend that he saw Avery and Dassey standing by a bonfire on Avery's property on Halloween night in 2005, the same night that Teresa and her SUV vanished after she headed to an appointment to take photographs at Avery's scrapyard. We also should not lose sight of the most damning physical evidence, the bones of Teresa Halbach, broken and charred, buried in the ashes of Avery's burn pit. Well, they weren't buried in the ashes of Avery's burn pit. We have no photographs whatsoever. Why do you think that is, Hamilton? The corpus delicti does not point inexorably to Dassey, but it is grim corroboration for much of the story he told investigators. Garbage. Conclusion. All agree that the governing constitutional standard for the voluntariness of a confession depends on the totality of the circumstances. The state courts recognized that standard and applied it reasonably to the facts before them. As in most cases of voluntariness of confession, relevant factors point in conflicting directions. A few factors and passages from Dassey's confession support the majority's view that the confession was not voluntary. But is that not reasonable doubt is all about? When you can show that there is doubt about something. Many other factors and passages support the state's court view that overall the confession was voluntary. No, Hamilton. That is completely bogus. That is completely wonky. The Wisconsin Court of Appeals could have been much more thorough in its discussion. I don't see how, but anyway, but its conclusion was within bound of reason. Remember the line about, the decision could have been based on a tarot card reading, but it might still be the right result. Well, anyway, it was not contrary to or an unreasonable application of controlling Supreme Court precedent. We should reverse the district court's grant of the writ of habeas corpus. As I say, very, very unpleasant reading, looking at the decision of Hamilton, but it's on that grotesque passage that Hamilton wrote that ultimately the Seventh en banc decided to go with the state. And of course, we had a lot of shenanigans going on even before the Seventh en banc hearing, with people retiring, strangely removing themselves, one citing a conflict of interest, the other in the case of I think it was Sykes, the lady who, one of the judges, Sykes, who Luke Berg had worked for her previously, had been a clerk for her. Anyway, it was pretty bogus stuff. Okay, that's not taken too long to get through. So as a special bonus, in probably it'll take me about 10-15 minutes to set it up, I've got another really interesting article, this time about, believe it or not, Laura Nyrider, and I think maybe even Steve Drizzen gets a mention. A little bit about what they're doing besides working on Brendan's case, which I think will be very, very interesting. So give me 10-15 minutes to recharge the glass, and we'll see you soon. Thanks all for tuning in.